Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the day 2 of the 26th RESC Conference and 11th National Conference on Language Assessment. And it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker for today, who brings wealth of experience and expertise in this field. He is none other than Dr. Maduranga Kalugampitiya, a distinguished scholar and academic whose remarkable contributions to English literature, linguistics, and the English language have left a significant impact on national and international scholarly communities. He currently serves as a senior lecturer and head of the Department of English at the University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka. His academic journey began with a Bachelor of Arts degree majoring in English from the University of Peradeniya, and he earned a Master of Arts in Linguistics from Ohio University, USA. Dr. Kalugampitiya obtained a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Ohio University, USA, where his dissertation titled Authorship, History, and Race in 3 Contemporary Retellings of the Mahabharata explored the intersections of literature, history, and race in contemporary retellings of the Mahabharata. Dr. Kalugampitiya has published widely in journals with works that examine complex topics such as race, the concept of the native speaker, and the intersections between language and socio-cultural identity. In addition to his academic and research contributions, Dr. Maduranga Kalugampitiya has served on prestigious committees such as the Gratian Prize Jury, which honors creative writing in English by Sri Lankan authors. He has also served as a resource person for curriculum development and revision at the University of Peradeniya, actively contributing to the initiatives of the English Language Teaching Unit, ELTU. Dr. Kalugampitiya was a member of the review team of the Further Learning modules, Appreciation of Literature, developed for 6th and 10th grades as part of the new curriculum reforms for the general education system in Sri Lanka. The insightful ideas and practical recommendations he shared will undoubtedly contribute to the enhancement of the appreciation of literature modules, elevating their overall quality. Dr. Kalugampitiya's academic and intellectual pursuits extend beyond theory and research. He actively engages with the broader community, promoting cultural exchange and fostering interdisciplinary dialogues on issues such as social justice, education, and language. His dedication to advancing scholarly inquiry and nurturing the next generation of scholars makes them an invaluable asset to the academic world. Today, we are fortunate to have the opportunity to listen to plenary speech delivered by distinguished scholar like Dr. Maduranga Kalugampitiya. On behalf of the Department of English and the RESC family, I cordially invite Dr. Maduranga Kalugampitiya to share his insights and expertise with us in this plenary session of the 26th RESC Conference. Over to you, Dr. Kalugampitiya.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that very flattering introduction. And I will try my best to live up to the expectation that you have set, the standard that you have set. I hope you all can hear me. Could somebody confirm?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I'm not a great fan of PowerPoint, but I've put one together for our purposes because I think that will be useful. Okay, you can see my title on the screen. At the very beginning, I need to apologize for the typo in the title of my presentation, which is on the published agenda. it should be corrected as the promise in the threat of GenAI. But the title, as published on the document, has the promise of. It's entirely my fault. I should have checked before sending the title in. What you see on the screen is the correct title for the session, right? Okay. So the plan is for me to speak for about 40 minutes and then open the floor for any questions and comments. And hopefully we'll be able to have a conversation on this topic. Right. So once again, the topic is the promise in the threat of Gen AI, an opportunity to push ELT in the direction of critical pedagogy. Now, if you take the first part of the title, I think there are altogether three key terms, but I would like to focus on the words threat and promise. The idea is general AI, contrary to what you will hear during the course of this conference, Gen AI is being widely perceived as a threat in the field of ELT, English language teaching. But the argument that I'm advancing is, yes, there is a threat because in the face of AI, we can't continue to do the things the way we have been doing so far, because I think what we are looking at is sort of a paradigm shift. There's a shift in the way in which things are done. And Gen AI is one of the main reasons that has brought about that kind of change. So there is definitely a threat. There is definitely a need for us to change the way we do things in the field of ELT. But at the same time, I'm arguing that this threat is not an entirely bad threat. It is a threat, but it is not an entirely bad threat. There is promise. There is hope. I was actually debating between the words hope and promise, but then I went for promise because it also means the potential excellence in the future. So the point is, within this threat, there is potential excellence. And let's see what that might be, what the shape of that promise might be. And the second half of the title, of course, an opportunity to push ELT in the direction of critical pedagogy. And I think that's absolutely necessary, particularly in a context like Sri Lanka. ELT needs to be pushed in a more critical sort of dimension, in the direction of critical pedagogy. It's not just teaching the rules, the structures of the language that should be done. We need to go beyond that with a specific intention in mind. What that intention is, we'll talk about during the course of the presentation. Okay. Right. Now, the theme of the conference, as far as I know, doesn't say anything about the English language, but then obviously I have picked a topic that is in line with the idea of English, teaching of English, and then resulting in assessment in that particular language, right? And that is a context in which I'm going to discuss these ideas. It's not about just any language, but it's about the English language. And that's how Gen AI is being talked about also at a global level. It's in relation to the English language. Okay, before jumping into the deep end, let's talk about the broader context in which we need to understand the presence of Gen AI, the intervention of Gen AI in the field of ELT. And I'm talking about this broader context, particularly in relation to the Sri Lankan situation. I'm going to talk about three contextual factors, and this image, I believe, represents the first contextual factor that I wanted to talk about. As you all know, probably this is an image that is being widely circulated on social media platforms. I don't know whether this is from Sri Lanka, but this really helps to make the point that I'm trying to make. So the point is, we are talking about teaching English. We are talking about assessing students' English language competence in a context like this. To me, this image is a representation of the unequal access to resources. If the caption that accompanies this image on social media platforms is anything to go by, these three students who are standing are from the same class, but obviously there are recognizable differences among them. One student, all of them are wearing the school uniform, but one student is in school shoes, proper shoes, and another is in slippers, and the third without anything. And in any case, the uniforms look raggedy, not fresh at all. And this, to me, represents the reality, at least part of the reality of the context in which English is being taught in the Sri Lankan context. There are people who can afford to avail themselves of technological resources, devices, and all sorts of facilities, additional facilities that would help them in the process of learning the English language. But at the same time, we are talking about a large number of people, I would say even an absolute majority, who are not in a position to afford much of those facilities, right? But when we talk about GenAI, the role of GenAI in, in an area like English language teaching, we tend to talk about it we sort of assume that this happens in a vacuum, right? We sort of assume that students have access to smart devices and whatever the devices that are necessary to access GenAI in a way that assists your English language learning. The reality is far from that, right? We're talking about unequal power relations. We're talking about people coming from vastly different socioeconomic backgrounds who may have different forms of access to GenAI, who may have different forms of access to the English language. So coming back to focusing on how things are done now, obviously, once again, there's a disparity in the distribution of resources. Some schools have more than enough teachers, but a large number of schools in the country don't have enough teachers. Particularly when it comes to English, there's a dearth of qualified teachers. But at least the textbook is the same. Even the students, particularly in the government school sector, state school sector, the students who go to schools, and the students who attend the most underprivileged schools, they get the same textbooks. But with the advent of GenAI, we are not in a position to ensure equal access to all categories. And the second contextual factor that I wanted to talk about concerns itself with the history of the language in the Sri Lankan context itself, right? As we know, Sri Lanka got English as the language of the oppressor. We got English as the language of the conqueror. We got English as the people, the superpower at that time, who came to subjugate the local culture, the Sri Lankan context, the state, whatever you might want to call it. And English was not a language that we naturally acquired. It was something that was imposed upon us, right? And it was used for centuries. It has been used for centuries as the language of the ruling lot. And obviously, the large number of people, the absolute majority of the people who are at the receiving end. So obviously, the English language comes with all these negative associations. And then you might ask, you might say, no, we got independence in 1948. Why are we still talking about these associations? The point is, the colonial masters may have left the country in 1948, but English continued to be a very powerful language in the Sri Lankan context. And it continued to be the language of the elite. It continued to be the language of the ruling class. And if you explore what happened in 1972, particularly the first Marxist upheaval, the youth upheaval in the country, one of the main grievances was that even though Sri Lanka had become an independent nation, the opportunities in society are still limited to a handful of people who could wield the English language well. So it had those colonial associations. And also, in addition to colonial associations, we are also talking about class associations. English is seen as a highly classed language. This perception that if you are a good speaker of English, you belong to a particular social class in society. The English language is limited, almost exclusively limited to the upper classes, the elite. So it has nothing whatsoever to do with the British anymore. During the post-colonial period, also, these ideas, this position of power for the English language continued. As we all know, in 1956, a decision was made to make Sinhala the only official language. And subsequently, Tamil was also made an official language. English was made an official language for a period of about 3 months, after which it was dethroned. But still, even though it's not an official language, we all know that it's the most powerful language. And it is still being used as a basis for division and discrimination. So when we talk about ELT, I think this needs to be factored in very clearly, because this is something that determines the success or the failure of ELT with or without generative intelligence. And there's a lot that has been written in this area, particularly scholars like Thirukandaya. He says that Sri Lankans have this love-hate relationship with the English language. On the one hand, we need English because that is the language of upward social mobility. That's the language that can bring you opportunities in society, opportunities in life. That's the language that can take you to the world. And for those reasons, we love the language. But at the same time, we tend to hate the language also. Why? Cultural reasons, political reasons, historical reasons. And there's a lot of anxiety that is associated with the English language. And for those reasons, we tend to hate. So it's this very ambivalent relationship that we have with the English language. We love it, at the same time, we hate it. So for those reasons, particularly in the Sri Lankan context, it's not like teaching yet another language. It's not like teaching, say, Spanish to a group of Sri Lankan students. It's not like teaching even French or Hindi or Gujarati, Marathi, Swahili, the whole works. English is different because it has a particular political and cultural baggage which travels with it. So that factor needs to be taken into consideration. And the third and the final contextual factor, which I want to talk about, was this idea of new varieties of English, the idea that English, it's not just one language that we can call English. There are different Englishes. This doesn't mean that these different Englishes are mutually exclusive. As we know, there's a lot in common. We say British English, General American English, Australian English, New Zealand English, they are seen as the native speaker forms of English. See, even in that category, within the native speaker category, we are talking about a whole series of different varieties of English. Doesn't mean, as I said before, that these are mutually exclusive, that they are completely different from each other. There's a lot in common, but still there's enough for us to say that these are different forms of English, or Englishes, as we call them, right? And not only those varieties, even in like across the world, we find different varieties. Sri Lankan English or Lankan English happens to be one. Indian, Bhutanese, Pakistani, Nigerian, Senegalese, you name it. Different varieties of English. And a lot has been said about the idea of new varieties of English in the academia. And a case is being made, it has been in the making for a long time, that what we should actually deal with, what we should actually introduce in our context is not really this archaic British sort of English, but a form of English that is closer to home and closer to heart, right? So even when we claim to be teaching standard British English, what actually happens is, in many ways, what ends up being taught or what ends up coming out from us as teachers is a variety that is somewhat different to British English. So in a context like that, what's the point in being fixated on the idea of just one form of English? Then you might ask, no, we are not teaching British English, we are teaching a neutral international form of English. And generative AI can generate that neutral international English. I would be a little hesitant, I would be a little careful in accepting that idea, because once again, much has been said, and scholars like Arjuna Parakrama come to my mind. They've pointed out what is being presented as this neutral international language is actually a form of English that is coming out of a particular context. So once again, we are talking about a form of English that is closer to the so-called native speaker varieties. So it's in other words, it's the same wine in a new bottle sort of idea, right? Very quickly, this idea of different Englishes, this new form of English, particularly in relation to the Sri Lankan context, let me say a little about the nature of that form. In a context like Sri Lanka, not only in Sri Lanka, but let's talk about it in relation to the Sri Lankan context. When it comes to L1 acquisition, and in the Sri Lankan context, for the majority, it would be either Tamil or Sinhala. L1 acquisition, when the child starts learning the language, acquiring the language, the child has a clean slate. There's no language-specific knowledge in the mind, in the head of the child. It's a blank slate, empty. And then the child is exposed to the language in the context, as a result of which the child acquires that language. And by the time of puberty, she has reached the end goal, the end point, the destination, which is the S state. So S0 is the starting point, and then SS is what is called the stable point, stable state. By puberty, she has acquired the language. She has internalized all the basics about the language. And that is the state that could be considered the native speaker competence in that language, right? Native speaker competence. If you go by the same argument, when it comes to L2 development, in the Sri Lankan context, that L2, for many of them, that L2 would be English, right? It's a similar line, but the starting point is different. We no longer call it the zero state. We call it the initial state, right? We call it the initial state because it's not an empty mind anymore. It's not a blank slate. A lot has already been written on the slate because the child already has language-specific knowledge, Sinhala or Tamil, or sometimes both. And then the child moves towards the stable state in that language, which is English in our context. And the idea is, the argument is, this is particularly an idea proposed by scholars like Larry Selinker. As the child moves towards the stable state in English, the target language, whatever that might be, the child's L1 keeps interfering. And as a result of this interference, the child, it becomes too heavy, as a result of which the child stops, the learner stops somewhere on the way. And this is called fossilization. If I remember correctly, this term is from Larry Selinker once again. And these are called interlanguage positions. Some may freeze their learning process quite early in the process. So they would be somewhere here, but some may go a little further. Some may get closer to the stable state. But the majority is going to be within this area. Braj Kachru, the famous Indian linguist, takes the same idea and says, when it comes to the form of English that is being used in contexts like ours, we start as monolinguals, and as we acquire the language, we try to be ambilinguals, where we have first native speakers of our own language, the native language, plus we have native-like competence in the target language, which in this case would be English. But once again, this interference happens from Sinhala or Tamil, Sinhala and or Tamil, as a result of which the development of the form of English stops, freezes on the way. And Kachru says this is the area where what we call new forms of English, including Sri Lankan English, Indian English, whatever these new forms of English, other than the native speaker forms, this is the area for those varieties. But then obviously the standard forms of English are at this end the best. And if you go by this thinking, these other forms are inferior to the standard forms, right? Thirukandaya takes this idea and says, no. He says there's a problem in this kind of thinking because in contexts like ours, when the students start, yes, they already have language-specific knowledge, the initial state, where they have Sinhala and or Tamil, and we think that the student is moving towards the native speaker of standard British English, standard English, whether it's British or not is something that needs to be seen. But Thirukandaya says, no, that's not what happens. In contexts like ours, reaching this target is not really a practical or something that we should do even. He says our target is somewhere else. And the target is the native speaker of Lankan English, right? And see, according to this diagram, Lankan English is as good, as resourceful, as legitimate, as solid as these other standards. And the learners in our context are taking this trajectory, this route. And as they move on, obviously, this road is based on what we received from our colonial masters, British English. But at the same time, we also have this other influence that is from our L1, Sinhala and or Tamil. And Thirukandaya doesn't call it interference. He calls it enrichment. right? So the point I wanted to make is, we already have a discourse on the idea of English, which presents these varieties of English, forms of English, including Lankan English, as legitimate, proper forms of English. And that form of English also happens to be the most reachable to the majority of learners in contexts like ours, right? So when it comes to ELT, that needs to be factored in, that needs to be taken into consideration. So tying this back to what we said about GenAI, the question that I'm asking myself is, how can we factor GenAI into a context like this? Because GenAI is not something, as far as I know, based on my limited understanding of GenAI, it is not something that is highly sensitive to these context-specific differences, variety-specific differences of the English language, right? So to summarize, the broader contextual factors that we've looked at so far: one, the socioeconomic concerns, considerations, access-related limitations. Number two, the ambivalent relationship that many of us maintain with the English language. It's not there for Sinhala, it's not there for Tamil, it's not there for Vedda, it's not there for Malay, but it is there for the English language, right? Very ambivalent. We really don't know what we feel, whether we are positive or negative about this. And finally, we are talking about teaching English in a context which is dominated by a form of English which is different to what is considered the standard, within brackets at least, British or American English, right? With those in mind, let's jump to into the deep end. There's a widespread perception that generative AI, things like ChatGPT and things like that, will render English language teachers redundant. It's going to take away the job of the English language teachers. Why? We no longer need teachers teaching the English language. The students can go directly to ChatGPT and get their English language needs met. Say, you assign them for homework to write an essay. It's very easy for the child to go to ChatGPT and get the essay written. And this is something that we see not only in ELT classes, but also in academic classes, subject-specific classes. Say, take literature. The student can very easily go to ChatGPT and get the essay written. And for this reason, there's this widespread perception that GenAI is going to render English language teachers, the other teachers too, but mainly English language teachers, redundant. And I think this needs to be addressed as a priority, right? Because I think there is some truth to this. Obviously, we said GenAI is not accessible to a large number of students across the country. So at least immediately, this threat is not going to be a major one. But this threat is there. And with the gradual expansion of technological advancements and access to rural areas, people are going to have more and more access to GenAI, which means the threat is going to be on the rise. It's going to be it's going to get more serious, right? But then I would also argue that it becomes a threat if we continue to understand the English language and also English language teaching in a particular way, in the way that we look at them at the moment, right now. So in the age of AI, That's why I said this is going to be a paradigm shift. It's not a minor shift. It's not a small change here and a small change there. We are talking about a shift, a large-scale shift, which is going to require us to rethink what we are doing in a completely different way. And at a time like that, I think we are desperately in need of a shift in two areas. One is in the theory of language, what we mean by language, particularly language in the context of language teaching. The theory of language needs to be looked at. At the same time, the theory of language teaching needs to be re-examined. And I'm pretty sure you will hear a lot along these lines, particularly along the lines of the second shift over the next few sessions. Okay, the first shift in the area of language, to the best of my understanding, the idea of language, the theory of language that we subscribe to right now is what you see on the left side of the screen. Language as a strictly structured entity whose identity is defined primarily by its structuredness. When we think of English, we think of a language that is governed by rules, sentence structures, tenses, different morphological categories, right? Word formation. So basically what we can see as the English language is what we focus on. We think if we know the phonology of English, we know everything about the English language. If we know the morphology, so phonology is, as we know, pronunciation. If we have mastered the pronunciation, we know, like, we have English under control. If we know the morphology, how words get formed, the rules that govern the formation of words, right? If you take a verb like sing, its past tense is made in a particular way, which is different to how the past tense of the verb watch is made, right? So morphological rules concerns themselves with things like those. And then we also think syntax, the tenses, different tenses, right? Question formation. If we know how these structures work, syntactic rules work, we have the English language under control. That is what is required of us as students of English, is a popular perception. This perception is actually based on the structure-based approach to language. Language is seen primarily as a set of grammar rules and a list of words to be memorized. If you can do that, you're a wonderful speaker, wonderful user of the English language. But I'm proposing that at the time of AI, generative AI, that if we stay clung on to that conception of language, we are sure to be rendered irrelevant, redundant. Because the students can get all that from ChatGPT, from generative AI, from artificial intelligence. They're not going to need a teacher to teach them the tenses, the different grammar structures of the English language. So I'm proposing, with generative AI in mind, we shift our conception of language to something else, and that something else is to see language as what enables the acquisition of a voice. Now, what do I mean by this voice? Voice is, okay. So in philosophy of language, something that we talk about is language is not simply a collection of grammar rules and a list of vocabulary items. It's much more than that. Using or basing ourselves on philosophers of language, we say that language is a take on reality. Each and every language presents or gives us a particular way of looking at the world, a particular way of looking at existence. This also means that it's not just one world, one objective world, which we try to describe using different languages. Rather, it's a situation where the different languages present to us different worlds. This also means the world that the English language presents to us, or the English language constructs, the world that the English language constructs, is different to the world constructed by Sinhala, or Tamil, or Spanish, or French, or Gujarati. And there's a deep philosophical basis for this claim, which we don't have time to go into. So the point is, let's change our conception of language to that. Language is not strictly a set of grammar rules and a list of vocabulary items, but what enables the learner to talk about reality, his or her existence, in a particular way. To talk about himself or herself in a different way. Right? And the second shift that I'm talking about is language teaching. Right now, the general assumption seems to be language teaching is all about instilling language structures in the heads of the learners. Let's instill, let's plant the grammar rules. Let's get them to memorize vocabulary items. What they write doesn't really matter as long as it's presented in correct English. Grammatically correct English is what matters. And there too, the point is, my argument is, if we are going to continue with a conception of language teaching like that, we are bound to be rendered irrelevant, redundant as English teachers. Why? This is something that the student is going to be able to do with the help of ChatGPT. She doesn't need help. She doesn't need a teacher. Obviously, the students need a particular level of English even to use ChatGPT, but then they're going to achieve that very soon. After that, the language structures, they can directly deal with ChatGPT and get their writing done. The only way to avoid that is to look at language teaching in a different way. The argument is, let's stop worrying too much about the students being able to get help from generative AI. If there is any help they can get from generative AI, let them take it. Because even if we don't want them to take it, they're going to do it. They're going to take it. They're going to go to ChatGPT. Even at the university level, we see this, right? So this is not something that we are in control of. This is not something that we can control. And there, the only opportunity, the only option that is available to us is to look at language teaching in a different way. And if I may connect it to what I said about the earlier shift, where language is seen as what enables the acquisition of a voice, right? A way of talking about the world. My first language is Sinhala, and I have a particular way of talking about the world in Sinhala. But if you take English, there's a philosophical claim, philosophical argument. You don't look at the world in English in the exact same way. There's a difference which comes with the language. right? And this is also why we say the more languages you learn, the better, because it's not only because you have different sets of tools, but you have different views, perspectives on the world, on existence, right? In language teaching, let's not worry too much about having to correct the minor grammar structures, grammar errors, pronunciation errors of the learners. That need to be done. I'm not saying that that should not be done, but that shouldn't be the primary focus of the language teacher I'm proposing. Instead, let's facilitate the acquisition of a voice. Let's help the student as language teachers, as English teachers, let's help the students to develop that inner voice. And once again, by voice, what I mean is looking, a way of talking about the world, a way of looking at the world. Let's focus more on content. Let's focus more on the ideology that gets promoted in the language teaching exercise, right? And let's move towards a voice that is truly liberating. Now, if I may give you a quick example, now I've been attending a lot of English Day events in schools, organized by schools. And very interestingly, what we see most of the time is at these events, the students get together and sing English songs that are coming from Britain, that are coming from America, that are coming from Australia. There's nothing really that is coming from the context, the local context, which the students themselves are part of. Which means they have learned the language, they have mastered the language, but still they're voicing an alien voice. They know English, but they only can sing the so-called proper British songs, American songs. But in Britain, in America, in that discourse, we are talking about a particular take on reality, which is different to how we look at the world in our part of the world, which is different to how we look at existence in our part of the world. Which means we have become successful in teaching the language to those students, but we have not really been successful in getting the students to do their own thinking in English. And that is why they continue to think about the world in the way how the world is seen in the Western part of the world. Existence is conceptualized in terms of how it is done in these outside contexts, outside countries, external contexts, right? What I'm proposing is, let's let ChatGPT help students with the minor errors, problems, language-related problems where possible. That doesn't mean we should not work on their grammar and things like that. Let's not take that as the only focus for teaching, in teaching. Let's focus instead on getting them to develop a voice that would really liberate them. A voice that would let them think about the world, think about existence, think about society from their own point of view, right? How to do that is something I think we need an entirely different conference to talk about that area, because it's an area in itself. It's a huge area. And if the NIE can organize something like that, I think that would really benefit the people like us who are in this field. As the final slide, this is what I wanted to end the note on which I wanted to end my presentation. As GenAI encroaches the traditionally assumed territory of ELT, let's take ELT in the direction of a more critical pedagogy. And in my view, that is the rightful direction for ELT. If I may give you an analogy, when the Anuradhapura kingdom was attacked by South Indian invaders, it was moved to Polonnaruwa. And from Polonnaruwa, once Polonnaruwa was attacked, it was moved to Dambadeniya, and so went went on the evolution of the local kingdom. It's just like that. ELT, the traditional territory of ELT, is being encroached by generative AI. We've been correcting minor structural errors, grammar errors of the students. Now, whether we like it or not, generative AI is going to do that for us. Generative AI is going to do that for the students in a general way. And there, I think we need to look at it as an opportunity to push English language teaching in the direction of a more critical pedagogy. And this critical pedagogy is what I meant by this teaching style, this approach to teaching, which would enable the development of a voice of their own, which would give the students the ability to develop a voice of their own interpretation of the world, their own approach to existence is what is being sought there. Like that is what we are trying to achieve there. Let's hand over part of the burden of ELT to generative AI and use that freedom, the time and the energy that we save by doing that, to focusing more on empowering the learner with a voice. So once again, I think what I keep going back to is this idea of a voice. And by that, again, what we mean is a particular way of looking at the world. And that's how our material should be designed. That's how our teaching styles should be planned. Because at the end of the day, true language learning is about being able to talk about our own selves, being able to talk about the world, being able to think about the world in a different way in the target language that is being taught. Okay, with that statement, let me wind up my presentation. I've taken 10 minutes more than what I said I was taking, 50 minutes, but still we have 10 minutes for the discussion. I would be happy to field whatever the questions you have and try to answer, if possible, those questions. Thank you very much.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
I'm Suresh Kumar speaking from Japan RESC.
Okay. Hi, Suresh.
Hi. This is one question related to how far AI can be supportive for multimodal and multilingual assessment process and education, especially in the multilingual education. Students can link with different language along with pair work in the real life classroom. Moreover, there is a need arises making students having the translanguaging skills at the same time to enable them in hybrid learners. So how can AI be supportive for enabling the student having the translanguaging and also the hybrid learners to become having the hybrid learning capacity to speak, understanding different dialect variations there are. So students should have the capacity of meeting that kind of competence.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. What's your good name, sir?
Suresh Kumar.
Yes. Suresh, thank you very much for that question. I'm pretty sure the question that you just raised will be answered in many of the sessions that are yet to come. I don't think I'm the best to talk about those, because I personally don't agree with much of the jargon that was used in this question, right? Like multimodal approaches, this hybridity in language teaching. I think there's a lot that like these terms actually, if my understanding is anything to go by, this understanding, like these terms, this terminology, only confuses the picture. It gives the field of ELT a very scientific, I would actually go to the extent of calling it scientistic, too much scientific. But then language teaching is about dealing with human beings, right? To me, it's best if we try to minimize the use of these technical terms. But that said, generative AI obviously is proving itself to be a wonderful asset, wonderful tool, wonderful resource, right? Because at the end of your fingertips, you have access to whatever the material. You can get ChatGPT to develop whatever the material you want developed. I'm pretty sure, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by this multimodal sort of approach, because there are different ways in which it could be interpreted. But the thing is, from the point of making material for teaching, we can ensure this hybridity, diversity is included in the material that is developed, and then how it is used for English language teaching is something that we as educators, teachers, need to do. But my presentation, my session was mostly about a more conceptual dimension of language learning. And that's why I said I may not be the best person to answer your question, because it involves very technical details of language teaching and generative AI. I would encourage you to raise this question, post this question to some of the other plenary presenters who will specifically be talking about such technical dimensions of the intervention of generative AI in English language teaching and English language testing. Okay, I hope that satisfies, that is a satisfactory answer to your question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any more questions?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. Uniqueness in the world.
Excuse me.
With certain context.
Okay, thank you.
So can I ask you one question?
Is this Ms. Fernando? Yeah, please go ahead. I think
I'm Rasika.
Right, okay.
Rasika from Sila.
Okay.
Thank you very much for thought-provoking session, sir, on making a uniqueness in the teaching English in Sri Lankan context to bring voice towards the world. And my question, sir, as teacher educator, you said that we have to have a deliberate voice that to really have our identity in the globe. So how, as teacher educators, how can we support them? In what ways, sir?
Yeah, an excellent question. And I think this is also the million-dollar question, Ms. Fernando.
Thank you, sir.
The million-dollar question, in the sense that this is a very challenging question. This is this is exactly what we need to figure out. And that's why I said we might need a separate conference of its own on this topic. And if the NIE can do that, I think it'll be wonderful. But to very quickly try to answer your question, it starts at the level of choosing material for teaching. It starts at the level of deciding on the examples that we choose to use. Just to give you a very simple example, I still remember some of the examples that we were taught, that were used by our teachers when we were learning English. Just to explain a grammar structure, they would use the example, Mary kicked John, or John kicked Mary, mainly to explain the SVO, right? If it is Mary kicked John, Mary is the subject, kicked is the verb, John is the object. If you reverse, John kicked Mary, John is the subject, kicked is the same verb, and then now Mary is the object, right? So as an example, it works perfectly well. But then we need to understand that this example is coming from a particular socio-cultural context. And a lot has been said in the area of English language teaching, and also in relation to the position of English in Sri Lanka, that many students, especially those coming from underprivileged contexts, they find even examples like these, which are alien to them, alien to the Sri Lankan context, to be challenging, to be threatening, to be intimidatory. And if it is not seen as an intimidation, at least it's seen as something alien. It is not something for us to, because like if you're teaching French, once again, it's normal to use examples from the French culture. There's no question about it. If you're teaching Hindi, it's even encouraged to use examples from the Indian context. There's no question about it. But when it comes to English, the situation is different. You can't say it's okay to take examples from England or America, because there is a particular additional socio-cultural baggage that comes with the English language. There is always a lot of tension in the context, like in relation to English. And if you use alien examples like those, that is actually going to subconsciously give the students the idea that English is not for us. English is actually for the Johns, the Marys, the elite, the upper class. So those are the areas. Now, my point is, this is not something that generative AI is going to be sensitive to, as far as I know, right? It would be okay with John kicked Mary. It would be okay with Mary kicked John. It will not talk about the Punchibandas. It will not talk about the Vadivelus. It will not talk about all these local cultures. So the point is, we need to pitch the English language at a level where the absolute majority of the students, at least the large proportion of students in the Sri Lankan context, can relate to. And there, I think, as English teachers, there's a lot we have to do. We can use AI, but then we need to ensure that the material that we use is adapted to the local context. Once again, this doesn't mean we can't say anything about the British or the American context. That's not what I'm saying. There should be a nice balance, fine balance, in terms of the material we use, in terms of the resources we use. So the point is, yes, generative AI is going to flood us with a lot of material, but then as teachers, let's be careful in making the choices. Let's be careful in deciding on what we are going to use with the intention of promoting this free voice among the students. I think that should be the absolutely primary goal of ELT, particularly in a context like Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much, dear sir, for the explanation. Thanks
You're
a
welcome.
lot.
You're welcome. I think we are out of town. Is there a representative of NIE or RESC? Do we have more time, or are we supposed to?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, is this Mr. Shamin?
I'm Rohan
Um,
from the RESC Polanaru.
Okay, Ms.
Sir,
Rohan, yes.
Actually, sir, I must say first of all that the teachers might find themselves transformed as teachers by the end of your lecture.
Oh, I'm flattered. Thank you.
And when you say, I will totally agree with the idea that the teachers must move from instilling the language structures towards facilitating the acquisition. I will totally agree with that. And my question is that, are you showing a red light to the teachers when you say, as GenAI encroaches the traditional assumed territory of ALT, you are suggesting to take ELT in the direction of a more critical pedagogy? So, by saying so, are you showing a big red light to the teachers, showing a threat in the future to the teachers in the classroom before AI?
I think I am. Maybe this threat is misplaced. Maybe this threat is not as big as we are talking about it right now.
Yeah.
But I think it's at least we need to take this as an opportunity to make certain changes in the way we do things, right? Because to go back to your question, yes, there is a threat. Because in the coming years, more and more online resources are going to flood this area of ELT. And that is definitely going to limit our relevance as educators in the field of English language teaching. So if we limit ourselves to the role of just correcting minor grammar errors, teaching the simple present tense, the difference between simple present and simple past, the difference between simple present and future progressive, that needs to be done.
Sure.
Don't take me wrong. I'm not saying the teachers shouldn't do that, right? My only point is we shouldn't look at that as our only responsibility, as our primary responsibility. Our primary responsibility should be something else, which is developing this voice. Let the students make the maximum benefit out of these resources. And if possible, let's make these resources even more accessible, particularly for students coming from rural areas. And based on that knowledge, based on those resources that the students already have, let's focus more in terms of getting them to look at the world, talk about the world, write about the world in their own way. So to come back to your question, yes, there is definitely a threat. And I'm definitely showing a red light. But then I don't think we need to take it in a negative way. Let's look at it in a productive point of view. Let's look at it as an opportunity, and we should be good.
So what happened to sir?
You're welcome. Yes,
so what happened to creativity that using AI?
This is the thing. Now, say you assign your student to write a poem at home. You assign a student to write a short story or even an essay. The thing is, the student can directly go to ChatGPT and get the poem written, get the short story written, get the essay written. But then if we make it specific enough to the experience of the student, if you require the student to write the poem about one of their personal experiences or one of the cultural experiences, I think that is the way to go, because that requires them to think about their own experience. And not only does it require them to think about their own experience, I'm pretty sure the students will even like it, because we like to do our own thinking. But then we quickly get distracted by all these facilities that are available around us. And if you make it specific enough to their own selves, their own experience, there's nothing much, or at least what ChatGPT, the kind of help that they would be able to get from ChatGPT would be limited. And that's exactly what I do in my English, like literature, language studies classes. I always make the assignments specific to their personal experience. Now, if I'm talking about the politics of language, I ask them to write about, generally, I ask them to write about an instance where they've faced injustice based on language. So they have to focus on their personal experience. And getting ChatGPT to write about something that is that specific to your personal experience is not an easy task, right? You may still be able to get help from ChatGPT, but I think if you did it on your own, you would actually save a lot of energy and time, because it's your genuine sort of input, genuine ideas that you end up writing about. If you use ChatGPT, you will have to worry about making it relevant to your experience, because unless it's about your experience, you will not get marks and things like that. So let's craft the activities in a way that the utilization of ChatGPT cannot be seen as the easiest way out for these assignments. Ms. Selhev, I don't know whether that answers your question.
Okay, sir. Okay. Thanks.
All right, Mr. Okay, I think this is, we've already taken 7 extra minutes. Is there anyone from RESC here?
So good morning, and this is
Good morning.
Nishanti from Mahiyangana RESC.
Okay.
And so I feel, I don't know how far I'm correct, but I feel to get the help of ChatGPT also, a child would have, now it was a problem of creativity. And I mean, they talk about the creativity, but the child should be able to word it in a way that the ChatGPT also in a better way to get the work done. So I feel that the child, whoever, should have that creativity as well as the language to reach that point. Am I right, sir?
No, in an ideal situation, that is exactly the case. Because if you take very experienced educators, they can very easily identify the difference between, they could say a piece written by a student on his or her own, and a piece written by ChatGPT. There are educators who can do that, who are skilled enough, who are trained enough to do that. But when it comes to, once again, the large number of educators in Sri Lanka, English teachers, I don't think, including myself, we have the ability, we have the skill, we have the training to tell the difference between those two. Yes, so what you're saying is true. The creativity, a certain part of the creativity needs to come definitely from the student. But even where that creativity doesn't come from the part of the student, I'm pretty sure there are many instances where what ChatGPT wrote for the student would pass off as the only outcome of the assignment or the activity. So I think, if to go back to your question, providing the educators with that kind of training is important, and that is precisely why I said maybe the NIE can facilitate this. There needs to be a separate conference on how exactly to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think we are out of time now.
Okay. Then thank you very much, Dr. Maduranga Kalugampitiya. Your session on the promise of the threat of generative AI, an opportunity to push the English language teaching in the direction of critical pedagogy, was really an insightful and interesting session. And thank you all the participants for coming up with questions and comments as well. It's very interesting to know your passion and dedication for teaching. And thank you once again, Dr. Kalugampitiya.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.